When I was 4 years old, my granddad taught me how to play chess. I remember we were sat on his dinner table. He got out this wooden chess set from a cupboard, and we were just playing chess for ages. He'd teach me how the pieces moved, some simple checkmates, and some basic strategies. But he never actually taught me any tactics. Tactics in chess are the most important part. Most games of chess are actually won through tactics. In today's video, I'll be going through 9 tactics that you must know if you play chess. So let's get into it. Hello, I should now be in the corner of your screen and there should be a chessboard. So let's get into it. Now, for understanding tactics, you need to understand what is a tactic. And a tactic is essentially just a way of making threats on a chessboard. Now, threats can be categorized into mainly 2 options. There are captures and there are forcing moves like checks or checkmate. Now, for example, white here only has 1 check, which is here. But this can just be taken and wouldn't be a very good move, as from my last video, you can understand that 9 points of a queen versus 1 point of a pawn is a bad idea. Similarly, you can capture here, but again, this can just be taken back, either by the queen or by the pawn. Not a great move. However, you can take this bishop with this pawn, and that would be a good trade since the pawn is 1 and the bishop is 3. Or you can take this rook and they can take back, which you can see would be a 5 for 5 trade, rook for rook. So that'd be a fine trade. Now, if we look at black's pieces, black has a few threats of their own. For example, black could take here, and after we take back with our bishop, they could take back with their queen. So if we look at the trade, we would get just their bishop, and black would get the pawn and the bishop. So they would profit 1 pawn, which would be a +1 trade for them, which would be beneficial. Black could also take here, which would be check. But it isn't too much of a threat, as we can just take back with the queen, or take back with the rook, or with the king. But the king, that would put the king in the center of the board, which would mean he's less safe. Black's main threat, however, is here. Now, this taking here would be checkmate, as this king can't come and take this queen because of this bishop, which would also protect this square. Now, there are multiple ways we can protect this threat. We can block it, like this. Now, they can't attack this square. Or, if we come back, we can protect this square again. So, if they do take, we can take. Or, I think most simply, we can just take the queen. Now, this would be our knight for their queen, which would be a 9 for a 3, which would be obviously a very profitable trade. And so here we traded our knight for their queen and their bishop, which would be a 12 for 3 trade, if I've done the maths right, and that would be a 9 profit. So obviously that's a very good trade for white. Now, the most simple tactic is called a hanging piece, and essentially that's just a piece that's undefended, which is basically you're making a threat on a piece and that isn't defended. So here, for example, can you see the undefended piece in black's camp? It's this bishop. And so simply we can just take the bishop, no repercussions. This is a completely fine and winning move, in fact, and white should be fine from here. The next move is called a fork. Now, a fork, it obviously is just something you just use to poke your pieces. But what does a fork do? It's got multiple prongs and can poke multiple different things at once. And that's basically what a fork does. And so here, for example, these 2 black pieces are undefended on opposite sides of the board. And so we can come here with the queen and attack both of them. Now, even if black moves one of them, so let's say they move the bishop here, this is now not hanging, this piece is completely fine. Well, this knight was completely unprotected and was completely hanging, so we just take that. Essentially, a fork is where one piece makes 2 or more threats at once. This could be checkmate, a hanging piece, or just a piece that's more valuable than the piece that's forking. For example, in this position, every single black piece is defended. So how can we gain an advantage? Well, this move here, knight e7, actually attacks the king and the queen at once. Now, as we know, the king must be protected when he's attacked, and so the king must come here, and that means we can just take the queen, and they take back. This would be, again, a 3 for 9 trade, which would be beneficial, and you'd profit 6 points. A lot of forks, like this one, are knight forks, and that's simply just because knights are a lot harder to keep track of since they jump and they can attack in all different directions. However, any piece on the board can attack two things at once, and so therefore any piece on the board can fork. For example, in this position, all of white's pieces are kind of far away from black's pieces. There's no way really any of these pieces can perform a fork. However, this pawn comes in. This pawn attacks two pieces at once, and therefore even pawns can fork. So let's say black comes back here, where you can just take the pawn, and you've profited a piece, 3 points, for a pawn, 1 point. So that's 2 points. Forks are very common. They're the most common tactic in chess, in fact. You need to make sure you're looking out for your opponent's forks as well as your own to make sure that you don't give away free material when you could have saved it yourself. The next tactic you need to understand is called a pin. Now, a pin uses something called an X-ray. For example, here, this rook has an X-ray attack on the king. That means that if it could see through all the pieces, it would attack the king. So, for example, if this bishop wasn't here, this rook would be attacking the king. This means that if this bishop moves, this king is being attacked. And here we see we can't actually move this bishop, because if we did, the king would be in check, and white could just take the king next move. And as we know, this isn't allowed. And so white can't actually move this bishop. In this position, black would have to first move the king, and then if we continue like this, now they can move the bishop in this position. But it's not just kings that can be pinned, and it's not just rooks that can pin. In fact, rooks, bishops, and queens can all pin a piece. For example, here we have a bishop. It's got an X-ray attack on this queen. And so if this knight moves out the way, we can see that this bishop can just take the queen. Note that because the queen doesn't have to be protected, you can still move the knight when it's pinned. Pins are very common and can happen all throughout the game. For example, this is a very, very common opening where both players bring their pawns out, bring their knights out, and then bring each piece out, both sides castle. And then here, white brings out the bishop to pin this knight to the queen. Now, how can this be used? For example, the queen here can just move out the way. Well, instead of this, let's say the pin is kept on, and this X-ray is still on the queen. Well, now you can put pressure on the pin. And now you're attacking this knight twice with two pieces here, the bishop and the knight. This puts more pressure on the pin, and the knight still can't move because you're still X-raying the queen. And if the knight moves, you can just take the queen, as you can see here. Putting pressure on a piece like this is very, very powerful and can often mean that you win material or put a lot of frustration onto your opponent. Another example of using a pin during a game is this opening trap in the Caro-Kann. It starts like this. This is the Caro-Kann setup. This is the main line. And here, black brings out their knight onto this square. This is a very uncommon move here for white, but it sets up this pin, which we will see in just a moment. If black comes here, the white can actually just come here. And this is actually checkmate. Now, why is this checkmate? Well, the king is under attack and can't move anywhere. And you can't actually take the knight, because if you take the knight, this queen would be able to attack the king. And so this pawn is pinned. And so it can't take the knight, even though it's right next to it. This is called a smothered mate. And I actually saw this exact game happen at the British Championships earlier this year. It can happen at the highest level, and so many people can just overlook tactics like this. The next tactic you should know is called a skewer. Now, they're all called something strange, some kind of implement, some kind of cooking utensil, like a fork, a pin, a skewer. But this is the last one, I promise. Now, a skewer is essentially the opposite of a pin, where the more valuable piece is in front of the less valuable piece. So, for example, here, you can come rook here, and this would attack the king, but also it would attack the bishop. So now the king is forced to move, and we can just take the bishop. Again, it's not just the rook that can skewer. Queens and bishops can also skewer. For example, in this position, these two pieces are lined up along this diagonal. And so, in this position, white can just move their bishop over here to b3 and skewer these two pieces. Since the queen is more valuable than the rook, black would rather lose the rook than the queen, and so they move the queen out of the way so you can take the rook. Black can take back, but still loses the exchange, and so therefore a skewer is quite a powerful technique. The next tactic that you need to know is called the discovered attack. This is where two pieces make separate threats in just one move. For example, in this position, the white rook has an X-ray attack on the black king. If this bishop here moves, then this rook will be able to attack the king. So if this bishop moves here, for example, then this rook attacks the king and it's check. If the bishop instead moves here to h5, then the bishop is attacking the queen whilst this rook is attacking the king. This means that the king must be moved, and when the king moves, you simply just take the queen. This happens because you're attacking two pieces at once and only one can be prioritized. Another example is in a similar opening as I showed you before, where both players move their pawns out, then they move their knights out, then the bishop, and instead here, where before white moved the bishop, black moved the bishop out, now black takes here because this pawn is undefended. Well, this is actually an opening trap, and white can move their rook here, line it up with the king. Now it's x-rayed onto the king, take here, and if black decides to take this bishop, then white can actually open up a discovered attack on the king. By taking knight here, you attack the queen, and your rook has a discovered attack onto the king, and your opponent can only prioritize one. And so, for example, if they come here, you can just take the queen. Or if they try and block, then you can just, you can take with the rook if you want, and come here. Discovered attacks are very powerful, and they don't have to always involve the king. For example, in this position, this rook has an x-ray on this bishop. Now that means if this knight moves, then the rook will be able to attack the bishop. And so you can move the knight to attack the rook, for example here, when this bishop is also under attack. Alternatively, if the rook moves, say back here, you can just take this. It's similar to a fork in that you've got two threats at once. However, it's different in that two separate pieces are making separate threats. You should always look for discovered attacks when you have pieces lined up like this, where you have an x-ray onto an opponent's piece that is either undefended or is more valuable than the piece that is x-raying. Now, a special type of double attack is called a double check. And now this is where, instead of making two separate threats on separate pieces, you make two separate threats on the king. So for example, this rook has an x-ray on the king. This bishop can check the king. Now, if you come here and check the king two ways, this is called double check. Normally, you'd be able to block the check, or you'd be able to capture this bishop. But if you capture, or if you try and capture, black would still be in check from this rook. And so the only way to escape a double check would be to move. And in fact, in this position, white would have this, which would be checkmate. Note again that black can actually take both of these pieces, as it can take this rook on e1 and it can take this bishop on c6. Black can also block both pieces. Black can come bishop e7 or bishop e6. But again, you can't block or capture out of a double check. Now, this is a very common and quite beautiful checkmate pattern that actually involves a double check. As we can see, this queen here has an x-ray on the black king. The knight is in the way. If you actually look at every single square here that the knight can go to, the knight appears to be trapped, right? However, we know that this is actually a discovered attack, and so therefore black would need to protect the king and wouldn't be able to take the knight if they could. We can go further into this actually and say white could come here, and this would be a double check. This means again that black wouldn't be able to capture either the knight, as it would be able to here, or the queen, as it would be able to this way, because doing that would not escape check from the other piece. This means that black has to move out of check, and the only square available to move is here on h8. Now, white's next move is actually a very, very strange move. Queen g8 check. Now, this may look really stupid. You're saying, okay, I'm going to put my queen where it can be taken by your rook. And sure enough, that's the only move that black has, and so that's what black plays. However, now, white can come knight f7, back to the original square the knight was on, but this time it's checkmate. This king can't move and this knight can't be taken. This is a very common sequence, so look out for this one. It's always very impressive when someone can pull this off, as sacrificing your queen and then checkmating with just a knight just looks so beautiful. The next tactic that you need to know is called deflection. Now, as we can see here, white has lined up his bishop and queen on h7, where it would be checkmate if it weren't for this knight. Now, what you should think is, how can we get rid of this knight? Now, this knight obviously protects this square on h7. However, it's called an overworked piece, because it also has other responsibilities. It's also protecting this knight on d5. And so, if we come here, if we take this knight on d5, and black takes, well, the queen can come here and give checkmate on h7. If black doesn't take and tries to protect the queen and say comes back here, then we can just take the knight. And now if black takes back our knight, we can, again, we've removed the defender and we can go on h7 and give checkmate. Again, this is called deflection, and it happens when there's an overworked piece like this knight here on f6. This is another position where white has a deflection tactic. See if you can pause the video and spot the deflection tactic. I'll give you a few seconds. If you pause the video and manage to find it, then very well done to you. And if you didn't pause the video or if you didn't find it, then that's fine. But the overworked piece in black's camp is actually this queen here on e7. Now, why is this? Well, actually, again, this queen is looking at checkmate on h7. It can come here, and this would be checkmate if not for this queen. But this queen is also doing some other responsibilities. For example, it's defending this rook on d8 as well. And so, if white comes here and takes on d8, then black has to capture, and then we can come here, and that would be checkmate. Again, we've deflected the queen off of h7 and onto another square where it's not looking at h7, and this means that we can give checkmate. Deflection is a very common tactic, and there's actually a very good example in an opening that I play myself called the Mara Gambit, specifically the Siberian trap. And it goes like this, e4, c5, and then you gambit away the pawn, and then the knights come out like this, the queen comes out, and now black comes here. And again, the queen is looking at h2, checkmate. Now, a very common move in this position is for white to try and kick away this knight. After all, it is, threatening checkmate. And so, white would come here, h3. h3 here is actually a blunder, because there is a deflection tactic on the board. This knight is an overworked piece. Again, it's defending this square on h2, threatening checkmate, and it's also defending this key square, d4, which in the Mara Gambit is a very important square. This can be exploited by black coming here, knight d4. Now, what does this do? Well, as I mentioned, this knight is defending this square, and so it attacks this knight. If white takes this knight, which appears to be free, then black can come here and give checkmate on h2, since this knight is no longer protecting the square. Knight d4 also attacks the queen, and so you must move the queen unless you want to lose your queen. So you come back to d1, for example, but now black can just take here on f3. After taking on f3 and taking back with either the queen or the pawn, it doesn't really matter. Again, the knight is removed from the board and the queen can come and deliver checkmate on h2. So make sure when you see a piece that's got multiple responsibilities to look out for deflection tactics, as overworked pieces often lead to deflection. The next tactic you should know is called trapping. It occurs when, as you might guess, a piece has no squares to go to. For example, in this position, if we come a3 here and the bishop decides to drop back as opposed to either taking or coming back here to the safer squares of e7 and d6, then we can actually push here on b4 and drive the bishop further back. Again, the bishop only has one square, and so we can push again even further to c5. Now, as we can see here, we're attacking the bishop with the pawn, but the bishop doesn't actually have any other squares to go to. Now, the bishop, it can't obviously come back here to a7 or c7 because that's where its own pawns are. If it takes, it will just get captured, and if it comes here to a5, then it will just get taken as well. So this bishop is trapped. Tactics like these can happen at any point during the game. For example, here we have an endgame situation. Now, black's knight is on the edge of the board, which means it only has 4 squares that it can actually go to, as opposed to if it was in the center of the board, it would have 8. As we can see, this bishop actually cuts off these 2 squares from the knight, and the king cuts this one off. And so, if we move king here to c2, we actually cut off every single square that the knight can go to. This knight is now trapped. And so, no matter what black plays, if they try and push their pawns, we can just come in, and again, all of these squares are taken by white. Black can't move their knight to any of their squares, and so we can just take the knight. And this should be a completely won endgame for white. Another example of a trap piece is in the French defence. Here, after a few exchanges, black brings their queen out early, which is often a big mistake. This is because it can be attacked by multiple pieces at once, and here white plays a very quiet but subtle move, h3. Now, this takes away all of these squares from the queen. As you can see, the queen can't move anywhere. And so if black just plays any random move, for example, h6, now we can play g4. And this takes away all the squares from the queen and attacks the queen, and so therefore the queen is trapped. As you can see here, there are no moves that the queen can play where it won't be taken. Pieces are most likely to be trapped if they're on the edge of the board, as they already have fewer moves to make, as they can only go in a few directions. But you should always look out for pieces that don't have many squares that they can go to and see how you can attack them or see if you can trap them. Finally, we have the in-between move, which is sometimes also called the intermezzo, which I believe is Italian for in-between, or Zwischenzug, which is German for I have no idea what that means, but probably something to do with in-between or something like that. Now, the in-between move is, as it says on the tin, a move that goes in between other moves. Now, what does that mean? Well, for example here, this bishop is putting a pin on this knight. Now, what if black wanted to put more pressure on the pin, as we discussed earlier, by, let's say, going knight h4? Well, this would actually be a bad mistake, because white has this move, queen here. This is a check, and as we know, when the king is attacked, the king must be protected, and so black protects the king. However, now this knight is no longer pinned to the queen, and so we can just take this knight that was there to place pressure onto the pin. This in-between move allowed us to escape the pin and create some threats of our own. Another example of an in-between move would be here, if white decided to come bishop b5. Now, the defender of this bishop is this knight. And so if we take the knight and we're allowed an extra move, we can then just take this bishop. But if we take this knight, it's check. And so white would have to deal with that check. And then after that move, we can just take the bishop. And so here, if we come here and white takes back, now we come here. As we see in this position, white has to deal with this check before it can take the queen. And so therefore, we can just take the bishop for free. If you've been paying attention this whole video, you might say, hang on, this knight isn't actually defending this bishop. Because if you look, this knight is pinned to the king. And so if we did take the bishop straight up with our queen, white wouldn't actually be able to take back with the knight. If we look, white can't move this knight at all. Because as you can see, if it did move, white would just be in check. In fact, black could even take this pawn here on e4. This is because, again, this knight isn't defending it because it's pinned. This goes to show, in any situation, how there are so many tactics available on the board. This goes back to what I said right at the start of the video, where I said most chess games are actually won through tactics. Because tactics are so important, you need to make sure you practice them. You can practice them for free on Lichess, or just remaining vigilant throughout your games and trying to spot as many tactics as you possibly can, both for your opponent and for yourself, is the best possible way to get better at tactics. There you go, guys. That's 9 tactics that you should know if you're just starting out at chess, or if you've been playing chess for a long time and you don't know some of these, then now you do. Yeah, thank you very much everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, all of that. I'm doing beginner series, and then after that I'll be doing more advanced tactics and chess videos. Yeah, here's my proof that I play chess. I've got a chessboard in the background. Here's my proof that I'm cool. I've got a teddy bear. Here's the proof that I don't tidy my bed. Yeah, and here's the clothes chair that everyone has. So yeah, I don't know why I'm just pointing random shit in my room now, but there you go. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one. Oh, and real quick before I go, make sure to check the top link in the description right now if you want to improve your chess even faster. Bosh. Thank you very much. Goodbye.